always been fascinated by my grandfather, not just because he's a cool-looking person, but because he had spent most of his time hidden in these massive warehouses with all these gigantic machineries and odd-looking mechanical contraptions. It was all really weird and very mysterious. Oftentimes, I had different theories about what he did. Sometimes, I'd even wonder what he was. So that day, as a young boy, brimming with a curiosity I could no longer contain, I worked up the courage and I decided once and for all I was going to step into his office, see him and ask him about it. And that's what I did. I went up to my grandfather, I looked him in the eye, and I asked him, "Grandpa, are you a robot?" My grandfather looked shocked, as if I discovered a big secret of his life. And to my big surprise, he said to me that he was not. Otherwise, this would be a totally different TED Talk. But he said he was something cooler than a robot. He said he was an entrepreneur, an equally science fiction-esque word that I'd never heard of before, that he graciously explained to me with his story. He was in his late 30s at the time, a Japanese who decided to move to Taiwan in order to pursue the dream of actually starting a business. And when he first arrived, he spent 5 years working odd jobs here and there just so he could save enough money because it was so expensive to actually start a business. And then, besides that, being an immigrant, he knew nobody. So he spent another 2 years waiting tables in his free time so he could actually meet people and build contacts. And when he finally had the contacts and the money and finally launched his business, he spent another almost 2 years just to get his first 50 customers, literally by going door to door. And he told me this journey that was very much defined by difficulty and told me business was characterized by difficulty. And an entrepreneur was essentially a person who was like an adventurer, who was either bold enough or perhaps foolish enough to undertake such a treacherous journey in order to achieve the greatness of one day having your own business. And my grandfather told me not to forget these words. Maybe he meant it as a warning. He said, this was the path to be expected. Although not robotic, my grandfather was certainly quite prophetic, because years later, I did actually become an entrepreneur in my own right. And I did, for the past 7 years, also go on the journey of entrepreneurship. But the journey I went on, the journey I've experienced so far, is very different. So different that if I were to take my grandfather's story as a benchmark, then I can firmly say this to you all today. Entrepreneurship, as we know it, has evolved significantly. And the driving force of this evolution is technology. You see, today we live in societies that are immersed and awash with unimaginable technological advancements that have not only changed our lives, but it's also changed the very nature of entrepreneurship as we know it. So much so that I often wonder how my grandfather would feel if he were to start his business today. What would be different? What would be the experience? Well, to start with, technology has effectively dismantled many of the barriers that are associated with starting a business. Traditionally, startups, they faced a lot of challenges even before they started. For example, a hardware startup like my grandfather's would have to produce prototypes and eventually have their own workshops and factories to manufacture goods. A tech startup would have to buy computer equipment and then license softwares. A retail startup would have to have a retail store somewhere perhaps on the high street. Yet today, in stark contrast, the image is very different. Hardware startups no longer require their own factories, as today with technology we can very easily go to offshore manufacturing from countries as far as China or Vietnam, just through a few Skype calls. Open source software and cloud computing allows tech startups to actually engage in a digital space without necessarily having their own equipment, servers, or even development teams. And retail startups can now launch online stores in a matter of minutes, reach and sell to customers instantaneously, perhaps more effectively. Even being an entrepreneur starting out, you no longer have to have your own office, as you can very easily work with teams halfway across the city, maybe even halfway across the world. And the biggest challenge for any business of actually reaching your customer, your market, today you no longer require insane marketing budgets, as with social media and similar platforms. What would have taken my grandfather years, today takes days, maybe even hours. The direct impact of this is that the cost of getting first product to market has dropped by a factor of more than 100 in the last decade. Entrepreneurs can now start businesses for thousands rather than millions. And the playing field has been substantially leveled. Whereas in the past, capital was the major barrier towards entrepreneurship. Only those who had it could effectively participate in industries because it meant effective access to resources and direct marketplace involvement. Today, that's no longer the case. Another significant outcome is that the diminishing cost of starting a business has also substantially reduced the huge risk factor associated with being an entrepreneur. In the past, being an entrepreneur was very much like climbing Mount Everest. You only had a single life-threatening opportunity to get it right because of the immense resources it demanded of you, as well as the insane challenges you had to overcome just to test a single hypothesis. But today we can very easily and rapidly validate, discard, and iterate ideas, oftentimes overnight, leading to active pivoting as a strategy, as well as a trend of entrepreneurship today. And what technology has done in this sense is that it's evolved entrepreneurship to make it lose its exclusivity, as well as its fatality. In entrepreneurship today, the evolved entrepreneurship brings us closer to the economic theories of free market and free market access, and encourages competitive forces at a scale that we've never seen before. We live in very incredible times in that sense. In a similar capacity, external business funding has also transformed and evolved in the digital age. The plummeting cost of starting a business has no doubt collapsed the investment size required of financiers, allowing business investors to engage in venture capital without too drastically affecting their fund. This has led to the growth and the proliferation of venture capital globally. But more importantly, technology has also transformed how entrepreneurs and those starting businesses access funding altogether. In the not-so-distant past, if an entrepreneur wanted to raise funds, he'd have to approach an established financial institution operating such a fund, and those are usually commonplace and found within established and very well-developed capital markets around the world in big cities like Hong Kong, New York, London, San Francisco. And the issue with that is that it was a very inefficient way to raise capital because the success of it was largely dependent on the geographical accessibility of the entrepreneur, as well as his personal network. Today, technology has created unparalleled access to venture capital. Entrepreneurs can now source capital from all over the world. Any of us sitting here right now could easily pull out our phones and access investors in other countries, leveraging platforms like AngelList, Crunchbase, E27, Angels Network, just to name a few. And the importance of this is no longer are we geo-locked. And the other important implication is that risk capital is tolerated differently in different countries. With some countries like Singapore, for example, where it's actually more welcomed and statistically more invested. In fact, my own startup is a great example of this. We were largely funded by investors from Dubai that we had met on LinkedIn, just because we had no other options. And that's why, entrepreneurs of the past, they were largely self-financed because they had very little choice. But today, technology has actually created opportunities of a global dimension. And because of this, we should all have global outlooks because now we have global solutions to local problems. In a very similar capacity in the same space, technology has also given rise to the emergence of entirely new forms of seed capital. Most notably, if you think about it, traditionally speaking, venture capital was very hard to attain because the entire risk of the investment was really in the hands of the investors. But today, the internet facilitates funding of Melvin from a multitude of parties, most notably through the novel way of crowdfunding, where now the investment and the risk is distributed towards a much wider group of people, making it more personally acceptable, as well as more easily attainable for the entrepreneur. And since its emergence, crowdfunding has actually generated billions in lieu of venture capital. It has actually caught up in terms of speed to traditional funding. In fact, in 2015 alone, just one single year, crowdfunding raised a total of $34 billion just in a single year, with notable companies like Oculus Rift relying on such methods when there are no other choices. So what technology has effectively done is it's created a new public capital market that is accessible to all, and that no longer are we restricted by the confines of traditional private equity. So what is the extent and the gravity of these evolutions so far? Well, think about it. Technology has basically eradicated barriers, diminished costs, transformed funding, and what that has done collectively is it's actually democratized entrepreneurship, making it accessible to all. And the democratization of entrepreneurship has led to an evolution of the demographics of the entrepreneurs. Today's entrepreneurs look very different to those of the previous generations. In the past, most entrepreneurs would typically start their journeys earliest in their late 30s to around their 50s. It was almost so common that it was an unspoken rule that you at least had to have half your life lived, maybe had a midlife crisis at some point, and then eventually, with the education, expertise, degrees, you go into business. The typical celebrated entrepreneurs of the past would be someone besides these people like J.P. Morgan, who was in his 50s before he even started. Yet today's entrepreneurs, they look different. They're getting younger and younger. And they certainly don't look like my grandfather or really any one of the past generations. But why this is so important is because what it implicates is that the advancements in technology have brought the tools of entrepreneurship to a much wider group of people. Age, experience, education, expertise are no longer the strict limitations as they used to be for the entrepreneurial journey. The information age has given us all unbridled access to an endless wealth of knowledge online, serving as tools of self-empowerment and tools of self-transformation, such that any of us sitting here right now could start to build a foundational and strong understanding of markets and industries, as well as the intricacies of business, starting with our laptop. That the starting point of making an impact today really is having the right conviction, the right ideas, the right preparation. And if you think I'm sounding too idealistic, consider that most of the change makers in the last 7 to 15 years are comparatively younger than those of the previous generations, almost by 2 times. And that really says a lot. Another noticeable evolution is the fact that there are now more women entrepreneurs. And this is so important because traditionally, many of the barriers that we looked at just then are particularly taxing on them. But what technology has done is it's facilitated their greater involvement, increasing their involvement in entrepreneurship. In fact, in the recent G20, it was reported that women actually make up to 38% of total registered SMEs. And what is quite incredible is that there are even countries now where women report equal and even higher rates of entrepreneurship than men. And that's something I think we'd be very proud of. Because in the past, we looked up to individuals like Ford, like Rockefeller, but today, there's names like Arianna Huffington, Sheryl Sandberg that inspires us to action. So technology has made our markets more inclusive, that all of us here, sitting here right now, regardless of our gender and our background, have the freedom to explore all business possibilities, and that diversity is no longer a hindrance, but a defining characteristic of evolved entrepreneurship. But not only are we seeing an evolution in the entrepreneur, finally, we're also seeing an evolution in business. See, with the rise of the digital age, the world has shrunk and become ever more transparent. Gone are the days where businesses could operate as if they existed in a vacuum and disregard true value and true utility and do the bare minimum. Because today, you very easily and directly incur social and market feedback, which is enhanced and facilitated by the digital space, likes of Google, social media, such that businesses today are also concerned about their footprints, their social identity, and as an extension of that, social ethics. Because as our society becomes more socially progressive with the changing times, we expect businesses to be reflective of this, and technology has held businesses accountable to this expectation, such that businesses today, they can't be too purely concerned just about profit and focus on profit. They also have to develop a sense of social awareness. And a lot of them not only have a sense of social awareness, they've even developed a sense of social drive. Socially driven businesses with great initiatives like Tom's and Warby Parker's that donate goods for every good sold are great examples of this. But it's not just in these CSR initiatives. It's also in the fact that businesses are humanizing today, where they're using their positions and their resources to help spread social values and ideals. Think about the emotionally charged advertisements that are being pushed out by big business about social ideals, family ideals like family values, environmental awareness, that kind of thing. They stand as stark contrast to the days of history when businesses would be purely focused on just profit maximization, oftentimes blatantly circumventing social standards, resulting in unethical practices. So what technology has done is it's actually made sure that if a business today is only trying to earn nothing more than money, ironically, they would be a poor business. And that the evolved business is one that is a social actor, active and visible and participating in the developments of society, playing a role that we expect as well. And this really is incredible, very different from what it was before. So it's a fact of life that everything changes, everything evolves, everything goes through a metamorphosis. Entrepreneurship certainly is no different. And entrepreneurship has seen a great evolution, an evolution that is driven by technology. When we think about this evolution, what we have to recognize is what it's actually done. It has made entrepreneurship more accessible, more democratic, has made the entrepreneur more inclusive, more diverse, and basically evolved the nature of business to make us question the premise of business and also try and create greater objectives beyond. So when we think about the ramifications of this metamorphosis, rather than just see it as an evolution, I suggest that we look back to this point in time in history as the beginning of our own revolution. And I say it is a revolution because it is in human history where, for the very first time ever, technological advancements have not only improved and changed our lives and our society, but it's also fundamentally reconstructed the very meaning and discourse of business and entrepreneurship. So for those of us sitting here today who are also willing to adapt and evolve our mindsets about what it takes to be an entrepreneur, then this really is the age of limitless opportunities and possibilities for you to actually create impact and bring value. But we must never forget that whilst technology can get us to where we want to go, without knowing why we want to get there and what to do when we get there, the road is meaningless. Thank you.